Hi, hello, how are you? And you're very welcome to the second of our videos to accompany the Sofa Symphony listening party. I hope you all enjoyed last week where we looked at the Brandenburg concertos of Johann Sebastian Bach. This week we're going to move forward in history and about 80 years forward from the Brandenburg concertos and have a look at the Fifth Symphony of who, for many, is the great symphonist of all time, Ludwig van Beethoven. We're coming to you again from the stage of the White Memorial Theatre here in Clonmel, and this programme is delivered as part of the Healthy Ireland initiative to keep well this spring, and with supports from the Tipperary County Council and the Tipperary Arts Office, and we thank them for their assistance. 2020 was tough on everyone, but spare a thought for the concert programme managers and concert halls all around the world. 2020 was the 250th anniversary of the birth of Ludwig van Beethoven, who was born in 1770 in Bonn, Germany. To celebrate this, there was a worldwide series of events celebrating the life and the work of the composer. Most of the world's great symphony orchestras had programmed and planned and rehearsed for this commemoration. Some were even performing all 9 of his symphonies in a cycle. In Vienna, Beethoven's home for most of his life, these celebrations were planned to be a year-long round celebration of the composer. Obviously, none of that happened. But it gives us some idea of the influence and the profile of Beethoven 250 years after his birth. There are not many figures in any art form that would receive this kind of attention. So why Beethoven? Well, for many, he's the ultimate composer. In his symphonies, like the one we'll hear tonight, in his piano sonatas, such as the very famous Moonlight, or his Pathétique, or his Appassionata sonatas, and his string quartets, these are regarded as the very best of those genres. If there is a Mount Rushmore of great composers, Beethoven's is an assured place on that. But a lot of the lingering appeal of Beethoven also comes from his own struggles in life, most noticeably from hearing loss in early adulthood, and how in overcoming these struggles he would produce such monumental works. Ludwig van Beethoven was born in Bonn, Germany in 1770. The family were originally of Dutch background, hence why it's Ludwig van Beethoven instead of the more German Ludwig von Beethoven. Like Bach, his early life was not without hardship or struggle. As a child, his father tried to pass him off as a child prodigy, a new Mozart. While Beethoven as a child had undeniable talent, he was different to Mozart and wasn't the performing child prodigy type. Following his mother's death in 1787, his father, who was a musician at the local court, had to retire his position due to chronic alcoholism, and Beethoven was left effectively as the head of the family, even going so far as to petition the court to receive his father's pension. At the age of 22, he moved to the center of the musical world, Vienna. Here he came under the wing of Joseph Haydn and was touted by many as the next Mozart. Here he would spend the rest of his life and create all the great work we remember him for. Vienna became his city, and despite his difficult reputation, just one example is that he had to move house 60 times in 35 years, an average of 6 months in a house at a time. The great tragedy, of course, of Beethoven's life is the hearing loss that he started to experience in his early 30s. In 1802, 3 years before he would compose Symphony No. 5, Beethoven wrote a document to his brothers, which is known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. In it, he describes his struggles with hearing loss and the near suicidal despair in which it left him. But in that same document, there is a defiance and a strong will to overcome his physical ailments in order to complete what for him was his artistic destiny. Prior to Beethoven, the king of classical era symphony was his mentor, Joseph Haydn. Big difference between them, though, is that Haydn wrote over 100 symphonies and Beethoven wrote just 9. So does this mean that Beethoven was a lazy composer? No, not at all. Beethoven's symphonies, though, are different to Haydn's. They are more personal and more deeply developed examples of his own expression and his own artistic identity. Each one of Beethoven's symphonies is a statement. He's the first composer in whom you can recognize that romantic ideal of the artist. All that cliches of a turbulent artist in struggle with the world, against society. This was Beethoven. Unlike his predecessors, he's not a court musician. He did have rich patrons and friends, but he wasn't reliant on a single benefactor or a civic religious group to tell him what to write. Unlike Bach, he didn't have to write a cantata for every Sunday and holy day, and he definitely didn't have to arrange the education of his students' Latin lessons. Beethoven wrote for himself and to express what he wanted to express in musical terms. In this, he's very much a product of his times, which were revolutionary and incendiary times. He comes of age during a time of the greatest upheaval in modern Europe. He's alive at the time of the French Revolution and the fall of the Ancien regime. The year he moved to Vienna is the same year that in Paris, Louis XVI was beheaded and the regime of Robespierre and the Terror was in effect. He observed the rise and fall of Napoleon. In fact, initially, Beethoven was a fan of Napoleon and dedicated his third symphony, the Eroica, meaning heroic, to him. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor and placed himself above the mere mortals of this world, like Beethoven, went against him and scratched out the dedication, which you can still see on the manuscript. To all this fervor and drama that was going on around the world, Beethoven is providing the soundtrack. His music reflects the revolutionary ideals and it encapsulates that revolutionary energy. The rules of symphonic writing have been established in the generation before Beethoven, particularly in the symphonies of Mozart and Haydn, both mentors to the young Beethoven. Similar to the work we looked at last week, the Brandenburg Concerto, the symphony typically has two fast movements on outer ends, at the beginning and at the end. In between, we usually have a slow inner movement. By Beethoven's time, however, this had expanded to a four-movement plan where a dance movement, usually called a minuet and trio, was added before the final movement. The minuet and trio is a light, bouncy, pleasing dance that was beloved of royal courts around Europe at this time. Also, since Bach's time, musical form, the structure of a piece, had become more sophisticated. Listeners had become more discerning in their tastes, and the rising middle class wanted something more stimulating than just ritornello form over and over. In this classical period, we have the most representational form in what is known as classical era sonata form. So a little word of warning. It's very easy to get confused between sonata form and sonatas. And there is some overlap, but strictly speaking, a sonata means a large-scale piece for a solo instrument, usually about 3 movements, whereas sonata form is a structure by which you organize a piece of music. So it doesn't necessarily have to be for a solo instrument, it can be for many instruments, like in this case. Sonata form can be a little bit hard for new listeners to understand at first. There's a lot of technical language to describe the various sections, and it can sound a little intimidating. And also, there isn't many examples in modern music that we can use for reference. But I think there are examples in other art forms that we can use to help. In movies and film, we have a 3-act structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's so familiar to us now that we almost take it for granted when we see a film, irrespective of the genre of movie. It's very helpful to us in terms of the storytelling and even our own sense of where we are in the story. Films usually introduce opening characters in the first section of the film, and the theme of the film is established. We normally also get introduced to any antagonists or any obstacles that have to be overcome. In the middle of a film, these characters normally develop. In an adventure film, this would be the hero's quest or the challenges and tests they need to go through to reach to the final act where the lessons have been learned and perhaps a final showdown and an epic battle to overcome the antagonist, and everything's wrapped up in a nice little resolution. At the end of all that, we should have an emotionally satisfying journey. So it might be a bit simplistic for us to think like that, but for our purposes, I think it suits when we're trying to explain sonata form. In sonata form, the beginning, where we are introduced to our characters or themes, is called the exposition. During the exposition, our main themes are usually stated in full. Normally there's a principal theme and a contrasting secondary theme in a related key. And we have the middle section. The middle section is where these themes are put through a series of challenges and changes and transformations, and it's known as the development. This allows the composer to explore and investigate these themes and motifs, sometimes on a real, atomic level. They can be extended or they can be pulled apart and sent through a variety of keys before we finally arrive in the final section, which is known as the recapitulation, where our original themes have come back, strengthened and transformed. The exposition section is normally repeated and played twice. The reason for this is twofold. It allows the audience to hear the opening section more than once so it can get familiar with those themes and get them into their ear. And secondly, by repeating the exposition, it provides a balance to the overall structure. We have 2 expositions, 1 development, and 1 recapitulation. By the time of Beethoven, this sonata form had been established as the accepted way with which to start any large-scale work, such as the symphony. And Beethoven did observe the tradition, but what makes Beethoven a genius was that when he needed to, for his own expressive needs, he would alter or remake or move sections around in the most ingenious way to suit his purposes. While a lot of these convention-breaking gestures from Beethoven might be lost on an audience today, the Fifth Symphony still has a punch and a power that no amount of overfamiliarity can actually really overcome. It still sounds incredibly dramatic from the beginning. We could be here all night doing a long analysis of this symphony. As I said, Haydn wrote over 100 symphonies, Beethoven only wrote 9. In those 9 symphonies, he concentrated as much work as what Haydn put into the 100. Beethoven's music, it's much more deeper in meaning and in the process of making it. He also expanded the scope of the symphony and the themes covered by it. And I don't just mean musical themes either. Beethoven's music is far more psychologically involving. The opening motifs, the opening melody of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is often referred to as the Hammers of Fate motif. They are meant to signify the inevitable destiny knocking on the door of Ludwig van Beethoven. They're pretty well known. I think they're probably the most famous opening of a symphony in history, but we're just going to state it again here. Last week, when we were talking about Bach, we looked at the ritornello form, where Bach would state his main melody, and then he'd bring it back throughout the piece, sometimes in different forms, but always identifiable as being descended from the original melody. Beethoven's compositional style was different and was more sophisticated. He would use motifs, which are short melodic fragments, and he would use them as the building blocks for other larger melodies, and indeed this whole first movement. We can think of them almost as like little Lego blocks. The opening motif, of course, is what follows is just a repeat of that down a step. And for the first minute of this piece, we hear an awful lot of this same rhythm of short, 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 long. And this continues. So we can tell there's very much between the rhythm and just this falling notion. This continues for the whole first minute until we get to what we call the horn call. And it goes like this. Much brighter, and it's followed by a more optimistic melody. Now, at first, there doesn't seem to be too much in common between and. But in fact, they're both descended from that same opening bar. If we took the first 4 bars, the notes were G, E flat, F, D, and if we added in B flat. That opening, is turned into which is our horn call, and the notes of the second melody, all come from our B flat, E flat, D, and F, which we had heard in the opening. And keeping that short, 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 long, little rhythm in the bass. It's through this that Beethoven gives the whole piece a cohesion and a uniformness that other works don't have when it's just melody followed by another melody. Often a little bit more sophisticated than what I went through there, but the same principle applies, that you develop your motifs, you develop the little fragments, and from them he spins out this entire symphony. The slow movement that follows that really impressive and dramatic opening movement comes in the form of what's known as a double variation. Theme and variations is another form or structure that achieved popularity during this period of music known as the classical period. A composer might take one of his own melodies or another composer's and set a set of variations. He would, improvise upon the theme. Beethoven complicates this by doing a set of double variations where he takes two tunes and writes variations on them. These two tunes also contrast with each other. The opening long lyrical one in A flat major and then one later in C major. So the opening one goes like this. And following on from that, we have a brighter, more triumphant melody in C major. After the second movement, the third movement in a symphony of this time would normally be a minuet and trio. But as we mentioned before, Beethoven liked to play around with these things, and so he doesn't have a minuet and trio, he has what's called a scherzo. A scherzo is an Italian word for joke, and they're usually quite fast and sort of impish in character. In this case, though, again, a little bit different. So Beethoven starts with what is a rising figure in the bass. And he answers it with a theme that gives us a little bit of a déjà vu feeling. Something about that should sound very familiar to us, and it is that short, 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 long. Even though it's just on one note, it's obviously descended from the same material as. Instead, though, it's. It's the hammers of fate. They're back again, and they're sounding a little bit more insistent than before. It's because of devices like this, a kind of a clapback to the earlier movements that give this symphony a unity and a sort of cohesion and helps to interweave all its parts together. rather than them for it to be a loose collection of separate musical works. To the end of this movement, it contains another first in symphony writing. The third movement of this, its coda, directly segues into the fourth movement. This is the first time it's happened in music up to this. It's a transition, and it makes the third and the fourth movement into sort of what we would call nowadays a medley. And this hadn't happened before, and Beethoven does it with this transition passage and brings us directly on the downbeat of first bar of the fourth movement. So, after the toing and froing of the previous movements, when the fourth movement arrives, it's as if all the drama and all the doubt has been banished. Up until now in the evening, the trombone, the piccolo, and the bass bassoon have all been cooling their heels. When these instruments do come in, they add a whole new range of high and low pitches to the orchestra. When they enter, they come in on the very first beat of the very first bar of the fourth movement. And as I said, it just adds this whole dimension of color to the musical spectrum. It's as if you're watching a film with a small black and white film on a black frame, and next thing, the frame is gone out, the film expands, and it's all in glorious technicolor. And the theme that they come in with couldn't be more positive and joyous if it tried. In the white light key of C major, with a full fanfare by the entire orchestra, it's light years away from the angst of the first movement. So. So, much different to where we were before. Again, we're in sonata form with a repeated exposition, development, and recapitulation, and an extended coda. Save just for one section at the end of development, everything stops, and our old friend comes back again. But this time it's weakly stated, and it's before the main theme in that really positive white light key of C major is back, this time to save the day. From there on, it's a genuine white knuckle ride to the coda and the final definitive ending with absolute resolution. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony would come slap bang in the middle of his series of 9 symphonies. He would continue to create symphonies that push the envelope of expression. His final 9th symphony, the Chorale Symphony that contains the very famous Ode to Joy, is always a poll topper in the greatest symphonies of all time list. His later piano sonatas and his string quartets are particularly ambitious for their time too. Much like Bach last week, the nearer he got to the end of his life, the more people thought his music to be difficult and too complex. By 1827, Beethoven was physically wrecked. His deafness was now complete. He had suffered from a list of ailments that included rheumatism, heart strain, a painful eye condition, and finally dropsy, a terminal condition that took 4 months to run its course. Modern DNA analysis on the fragments of Beethoven's skull suggests that lead poisoning was the most likely cause of his death. His funeral procession through the center of Vienna attracted over 30,000 spectators, and his grave is located in the Vienna Central Cemetery. Tonight's recording we're going to listen to of this work is by the Austrian conductor Carlos Kleiber with the Viennese Philharmonic Orchestra. It's not just one of the best recordings of Beethoven's Fifth, it's one of the best recordings of classical music, full stop. So please enjoy the music, enjoy the drama and all the color that comes with it. Next week, we're going to be listening to the work of Debussy and his symphonic sketches, La Mer. All that remains is for me to thank you for listening, and also to thank Healthy Ireland Initiative to keep well this spring, the Tipperary County Council, and the help of the Tipperary Arts Office in their support in making these videos. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week. So now, what you're going to need to do is below this screen, there's a link to the Spotify playlist that you will be able to hear all the music that we've been discussing tonight. Click on that and that'll open up Spotify for you. Also below the screen is a link to a PDF with a listening guide that'll help guide you while you're listening to the music. So it just gives you a little run through of everything we've talked about and a little overview of the music. Remember to keep Facebook open too, so that you can come in and view comments and also share your thoughts and share your comments with everyone else. Just a word of advice, if you're using a tablet such as an iPad or a small device such as an iPhone, it's generally a good idea to have a second screen to listen to the Spotify playlist on or to keep the Facebook comments open on, rather than kind of switching between the two on a small device or a tablet. You can do it, but it's just easier if you use a second screen. So we're going to give everybody a few minutes just to get themselves organized and set up. And the idea is that we'll all start listening at exactly 8 o'clock or pretty close to it. So that way, when you're following the comments, we'll all be in sync.